Of the draft report on the fossil fuel subsidies, but I have a holdover list from when we were in camera. I have Mr. Bachrach, who I think was not finished. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome everyone to our new public meeting. Having looked through the report and having talked to my colleague, Ms. Collins, who was involved in the drafting of it, we are confident that the body of the report reflects very closely the testimony that was heard before the committee. We have excellent staff that help our committees do their work. We have professional analysts. We have a professional clerk. Their work is always to the highest standard. Certainly at the Transport Committee, of which I'm a regular member, we go through the body of reports very quickly because it is very rare that there are any errors in terms of the depiction of the testimony that was heard by the committee. And it's a public fact, I believe, that this committee has met 7 times in camera to discuss this report. That's unusually long for a report of a committee, especially given that we're not through it yet. And I feel that the time would be better spent debating the recommendations, which is really the committee's work. Because as has been said before, we hear testimony from different people with different perspectives on the topic at hand. The analysts try to summarize and accurately characterize that testimony in the body of the report, well referenced. And then as a committee, we get to decide what we feel the government should do based on the testimony that was heard. And in my view, that's the most important work that the committee can do. We also have the ability as representatives of political parties to write dissenting or supplementary reports, which can, as accurately as we wish, portray our particular perspective on the issue at hand. So having said all of that, I would like to make a motion, Mr. Chair, that the body of the report on fossil fuel subsidies be hereby adopted in full and that the committee move on to a discussion of the recommendations.
Okay.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
This is a motion that is debatable.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I have on my, so I start a new list, and I believe I have Mr. McLean as the first speaker on the new list.
Oh, thank you. So now we're debating the motion here. The motion to just ignore. So my NDP colleague walks into a committee for the very first time, looks at a report that he hasn't probably read a word of about fossil fuel subsidies, which is a misnomer, and he comes up and says, "Oh, I don't want to even talk about the body of what's in this report. I just want to go right to a vote and accept it as it is." I can see that his job in Parliament is probably a little suspect if he's just going to think that somebody else is going to write the report that we have to sign our name to. He's a visitor at this committee. He's a visitor here, and he can take a look at all of the input that we've actually added along the way here through these 7 committees he's referred to, where we've actually talked to the analysts about what did this witness say here? Can we reference it? Can we add some value? Can we include some data? Because in as much as it is, this witness said this witness said this, in the end, we're presenting a report from Parliament that's supposed to be substantive. Now, Mr. Bachrach will know I've had this discussion with my parliamentary colleagues before. I would question him if he's ever participated in a report in Parliament that he can refer to any of his constituents referring again, and that's because they're probably worth about the paper they're written on. The fact that we actually go through this and actually provide some detailed perspicacity to it and actually look at what's happening here. Where did these opinions come from? Where is the background? Who is saying what here? And where is the numbers that actually substantiate what is going on here. And some of these opinions that we're reporting on here aren't just indeed that. And having those opinions, especially when they're counter opinions one to the other, having those opinions exposed with the sunlight of actual data and what's happening in the world and what's happening in the industry and what's happening in Canada is part of our job. We're parliamentarians. We're not just here to sit back in our chairs, smoke our cigars, and say, yep, the analysts, they wrote this, the witnesses, they said this, and that's all our job is here. In the end, we've got a parliamentary report from a parliamentary committee, the Standing Committee, the House and Commons, on the environment and climate change. And so we better put some detailed work into this. And I know from what Mr. Bachrach's comments, who, as I say, hasn't read this report, doesn't understand its witnesses, its references, the industry, or if I can say almost anything about this, he's coming in here and saying, we should just flush it, get it out there, you know? Don't even ask any questions about what's said in there. Well, I strongly differ with him.
Madame Posey.
Ms. Posey, yes. First of all, I would like to remind you that it is a motion from the NDP to study this over 4 or 5 meetings, plus the 6 meetings in which we studied the report. So I would imagine that Mr. Bachrach, knowing that he was coming here today, or at least that's what I would have done if I were replacing someone. So we discussed at great length in another committee that there were things that had changed since the report was written, but we also thought that we could table dissenting reports or complementary reports. That's always available to all parties, so I think that it's important to remind everyone of that, and to remind you as well that people who come before committee are experts. They have conducted studies. They have analyzed, conducted analysis. It's not just anybody who gets invited here. These are people who have done many studies on what we're discussing. So for all of these reasons, I agree with the motion by Mr. Bachrach, particularly more because in subcommittee on Monday I had proposed something similar, saying that do the paragraphs, should we just discuss certain paragraphs and say that all of the others are deemed adopted? So unless we stop at every paragraph, I think it takes goodwill from everyone. And I repeat, a dissenting report, a complementary report is also available to parties. Yes, reports, generally speaking, are quite descriptive. They describe what was heard. They're not doctoral theses where there's in-depth analysis. Mr. Longfield.
Yes, thank you. I also support the idea that Mr. Bachrach has brought forward, and also I support what Madame Posey is saying, that this was a motion to do the study from the NDP, and I appreciate the NDP now wanting to see us come to the next steps of discussing recommendations. It's unfortunate, but things happen when you have a change in membership on a committee, that discussions are history by the time they're picked up, and also time has gone since we've had our study and had witnesses, and we probably would get different testimony from witnesses were they to appear today, given the length of time that we've been studying this. So I think it's a great suggestion to go to recommendations, and within those recommendations, of course, they have to reflect the body of the report, but we can also make sure the recommendations are relevant to where we are today. So I hope we can vote on this motion soon so we can get to recommendations.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank Mr. Bachrach for his intervention. I think you made a very good point that we have very capable and skilled analysts and clerks and people that are helping us with this report, and that I find it very disrespectful, not only of the witnesses, but also of the people who work with us, to suggest that we have to go through with a fine-tooth comb every word. It is the job of the committee, when we are conducting the study, when we have the witnesses here, to ask the questions of them, to check the credentials. And I don't understand why the member opposite doesn't trust the witnesses, doesn't trust the clerks and the analysts, doesn't trust even their own party members who were here during the study. They were here to do that job. And I think the member opposite also knows that the point of during the study, our job during the study is to ask those questions. And when it comes to report, it seems to me that our job is to go through and make sure that there are no misstatements, that we don't disagree, or that witnesses were left out, etc., but not to question every fact and figure and the background of every witness, as you have been doing over the last 6 meetings. So I further question why the
privilege there. The honourable member can't talk about, like, it's highly unusual for the member to talk about what's happened in in-camera meetings, as we've discussed. It's super unusual for us to be doing this in public, and I'm glad we are. But it's highly unusual for a member to reference.
We can't go. We can't in any specific way go back to what has been discussed in camera. So, yeah, we'll just.
Point of order. Then, can I ask the member to apologize for misrepresenting something I said in an in-camera meeting?
I was referenced what you said actually in this meeting, Mr. McLean, not anything you said prior. When you started speaking, you were talking about not being able to.
Wait a minute.
Excuse me, I'm speaking, Mr. Lake. Point of order. Could I continue speaking and answering the question?
Too many
that was
points
asked
of order. The chair is getting confused. So this is we're on the point of order that we have to stick to. We can't talk in public about what has happened in camera with this report. So that let's all keep that in mind.
Thank you.
That's the other points of order. I've forgotten what they were. So we'll just have to finish. I'll stick to that point of order, and Ms. Taylor-Roy, I'll let you finish, and then we'll go to Mr. Duguid, Mr. Lake, Mr. Assassi, Mr. Courik, Mr. Bachrach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm sorry if it was interpreted as I was referencing something. I didn't mean to. I was actually referencing comments made earlier by Mr. McLean. To quote, that we are not just supposed to sit back and smoke a cigar. I do find that insulting as well. I certainly do not sit back and smoke a cigar. I'm not sure if you do. But I have actually been working on this study from the beginning and listening to the witnesses and questioning them when they were here with the Conservative members that were here at this time. And I found the questions asked by the members that were here at that time to be very good, very direct, very insightful, and to really challenge the witnesses that were here. So I believe, from my perspective, that job has been done. We also all agreed and had the opportunity to submit any comments we had in advance. That was not discussed in camera, that was before. That we had agreed to that. We actually put our comments forward, so there was the opportunity to do that as well. So I'm just saying that our job is being done properly. And what our job is to now look at the recommendations. That is where our opinions and weigh in, not in necessarily going through each of the paragraphs. So thank you, Mr. Bachrach, and I would support the motion as well.
Mr. Duguid.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to start off by apologizing to you, Mr. Chair, and apologizing to the other members of the committee that were here on time. I was not, Mr. Speaker. There were others, but I'll let other people speak for themselves. Mr. Chair, it is our responsibility to be here on time. It delayed the committee, and for that I am sorry, and I will, at least on my own behalf, ensure that will never happen again, Mr. Speaker. I won't describe all of the circumstances that went into that, but members on the other side did raise those points. I can't refer to what was said in camera, but Mr. Chair, I would like to call for a pause so that there can be discussions. At least I'd like to have some discussions with my colleagues and perhaps with other members. So we seem to be stuck, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to to see if we can collectively find a way forward. Thank you.
Mr. Duguid, Mr. Duguid,
So-
yeah, you were done, eh, Mr. Duguid? You're done with your? Okay.
Actually, I'm not, but I'm close.
No, but your intervention, I can go to Mr. Lake now.
Yeah, it's fine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, it's a very strange circumstance we find ourselves doing clause by clause, and it's called clause by clause for a reason. Doing clause by clause, where we typically go clause by clause as a committee, especially on legislation that is, you know, it's fair to say in this case, there's different points of views depending on perspective across the country, right? And so would be a very important part of the parliamentary process to go clause by clause. It's highly unusual to do it. I've never seen a report that would have as divided or as wide a range of views across the country on it. I've never seen a report just pass through without amendment. I've never seen that happen before. And so, you know, if we go down and we're just debating right now the process on a motion put forward by the NDP, and members from the Liberals and Bloc have indicated that they're going to support it, I find this, first of all, I find it completely unacceptable that we don't have the opportunity. I don't have the opportunity on behalf of my constituents in Edmonton-Wetaskiwin on an issue that everybody in this room could understand would be important to them, that we don't have the opportunity to even talk about the individual clauses of a report. I've never been a part of a process in my 17 years as a member of parliament on something that would have such a wide range of views. You see things that are unanimous, where there's unanimous approval of something maybe, but not on something like this. So it sounds like this is where the committee's going. It sounds like members from the government, the Liberal government and the NDP and the Bloc are united on moving this forward without any possibility to have amendments. But Mr. Speaker, just let me just put on the record, and I'm just glad we're in public for this, so Canadians can see this process sort of unfolding. Let me put on the record that I am very concerned about the precedent this sets.
Before we go to Mr. Assassi, I would say that the report contains all points of view on this. I mean, it's not. We're just describing what different witnesses said, and we'll sometimes.
No, Mr. Chair.
No, I'm not finished.
Okay.
But sometimes, you know, you'll have one view and then right beneath it an opposing view. So, what's also very important to keep in mind is that the recommendations are where we state our viewpoint as a committee, and if not everyone is in agreement with the recommendations, they can that the majority of the members agree with, they can produce a minority report. So everyone's voices will be heard. But
well, sorry, you kind of entered into debate as the chair with me fairly, and
I'm
I
just
understand
describing what's happening because
this is a very odd circumstance that we're having a public conversation, and you've been put in a very difficult position. I understand, but you know, I definitely, just to be clear, because of your comments, the analysts that we have working for us, because this is kind of an open door to a process that usually happens in camera, but the analysts do phenomenal work writing a draft report. But at the end of the day, it's members of parliament who own that report and put it forward. And I don't want to leave anybody with the mistaken notion that it would be unusual to discuss each clause and move clause by clause. That is what's normal. What's normal is for us to go through and take a look at each clause of a report. Mm-hmm. What's happening right now is very unusual, especially for a report like this. I just want to make sure that that's very, very clear, that this is very unusual.
Okay. Mr. Chair, I've got Mr. Assassi, and then if it's a point of order.
I listened very intently to my colleague Mr. Lake's remarks, and that may well be his view, but he did refer to this as clause by clause, and he called it legislation. And I would just like, for the benefit of the public who may be watching, to clarify that this is not clause-by-clause review of legislation. This is paragraph-by-paragraph review of a parliamentary report, a report that has already undergone 7 meetings worth of review in camera. So I appreciate the points he's making, and I think those are fair points to make in this meeting. I would just ask for some clarity around.
We'll go to Mr. Assassi now.
Well, no, on that point of order, he brought up a point of order. I'm going to weigh in on the point of order.
Wait,
Sorry,
just
I mean, if we're going to have the conversation, I'll withdraw the contentious language clause by clause and say paragraph by paragraph. I mean, whatever the case is, it is highly unusual
I believe
that we're
that you
doing
understand this as a report and it's
Right.
paragraph by
Thank you.
paragraph. Go to Mr. Assassi now, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I wanted to thank you for your patience and your perseverance. This is my first opportunity to sit on this committee, and I have to say, after almost 8 years, I have never seen anything this dysfunctional, Mr. Chair. And I say this because we have Mr. Bacharach, who comes here in good faith, my apologies, comes here in good faith, tries to offer a solution to make sure that this report is moving forward, and then we get all this vitriol for the members opposite. It's a suggestion. It doesn't need to be pointed out that this is the first time he's at this committee or that he doesn't know what he's doing. He obviously is an incredibly experienced parliamentarian, and he put it on the table as a good faith effort to move things forward. I think all of us can agree that this report has been stalled. It's pretty evident after, considering the fact that you have had in-camera meetings for 6 weeks. And instead of actually saying, okay, you agree or disagree with what he has to say, to personally attack him, and as if that's not bad enough, attacking the analysts and taking issue with the tremendous work that the analysts do. I've sat on a lot of committees, and I can say I have nothing but the utmost respect for analysts who sit there and they go through all the testimony and they try their very, very best to do it. But 6 weeks of reviewing their work can only suggest that you have disdain for the work that they do. And that, in
Point of
my
order,
opinion,
Mr. Chair.
Point of order.
Is there something that you can read us in the minutes where any of my colleagues on either side of the bench here have said anything about the analyst's work? What, so Mr. Assassi is all kind of bent out of shape
Well,
about something that hasn't been said?
I don't think I don't think he's literally referring to someone who
Mr.
made a
McLean, we
statement
know
like
that this report has been stalled, correct?
Point of order.
I'm not going to get into exactly.
Point of order.
Yes.
So I believe what's happening pretty clearly here is referencing in-camera work.
No, but Mr. Assassi has not been a party to the in-camera work, but
Well, to my point there, Mr. Chair, can you please, or can the analysts or the clerk please read something back that Mr. Assassi must be referring to here that says that anybody in the NDP, the Bloc, the Liberals, or the Conservatives have said anything negative about the analyst's
he's
work?
not saying that as far as I understand.
I'm not saying you said anything expressly negative about them, but
Point of order
the
again,
process of the
Excuse me,
Mr.
excuse
Chair.
me,
If Mr.
excuse me.
Assassi wants to back up anything
Excuse me,
he's saying here as far as
colleagues,
criticisms
the
of the
chair
work
has
that's
the floor.
presented to us.
No, I think what Mr. Assassi is not suggesting that anyone
Point of-
said
Mr.
not-
Chair,
please.
What you think Mr. Assassi is saying and what Mr. Assassi is
Mr.
saying are two
Assassi-
different things.
But somebody's got to be an arbiter.
Point of order.
An arbiter here. But Mr. Assassi is saying is the fact that it took 6 meetings or 7 meetings suggests that
said in camera, but I think the only conclusion one can come to that they don't know what they're doing if it's taken 6 weeks. So all I mean to say is, if anyone
point of order,
does
Mr.
have-
Chair.
and I get it, Mr. Lake
This
is
is
saying,
colleagues.
I'm not quite
Mr.
sure.
McLean, I had
this
a
is-
point of order before you, sorry.
I think these are all points of debate. None of these
I
are
actually
points
had a point of
of order.
order.
But everything else is a point of debate. We're all debating what Mr. Assassi means.
What we keep hearing from the members opposite
Excuse me,
is that...
Mr. Assassi, Ms. Taylor-Roy has a point, which
Point
I
of
hope is a
order,
point of
sorry.
order.
Yeah, my point of order is simply that when you are making a ruling, when you are saying something, I believe that members are supposed to respect that. And my point of order that is I don't see that happening right now. So
well-
I'd just like to point that out and ask the members all to, when you were talking, when you were making a response, to stop until you are done. Thank you,
Okay,
Mr.
so
Speaker.
anyway, so thank you, but we're okay, Mr. Assassi, continue, and then we'll go to Mr. Couric, Mr. Bachrach, Mr. Deltel, Mr. McLean. Mr. Dogood.
So all I'd like to plead with every member here is surely it's appreciated that there are some disagreements insofar as the substance of this report is concerned. But you have to find a way forward. And I'm sure that just constantly making sure that this report is not adopted is not in the best interest of anyone on this committee. So I just say this as someone who has never seen anything this dysfunctional. In the 8 years that I have sat through so many committees, and just hoping that everyone will decide to see the light. And even if you can't agree on things, if someone does come up with a suggestion, there's no point in like trying to, bring him down and say, question his motives and say that how he has no right to say that because this is the first time he's sitting here. Surely we can agree to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And, it's certainly, we're in, I'm not sure that it would be considered uncharted territory. I'd have to reference the vast array of parliamentary proceedings that have predated the happenings of today. But certainly some of the accusations, insinuations that have been made, certainly by the members opposite, are very concerning. For everybody watching, the move to do this public is unusual because generally what is standard practice is there is conversations about work that the committee does. The analysts, the clerk, and a whole group, translators, there's a whole host of people that it takes to put reports together. And then as members of Parliament, of which its reports are in the name of members of Parliament. We work together to put together these reports. There is often disagreement, and disagreement, quite frankly, is okay. And in our democratic system, it's actually key. And when we have a circumstance where there is that disagreement, that's when generally a vote is called and a path is decided, therefore, by a majority. But I find it troubling, and I would reference a precedent that we may be setting here, that a committee would limit the opposition's ability to meaningfully engage in subject matter that we find very, very important. We have had a report that has been before us for more than a year. Now, during that time, there have been a host of other studies that have actually taken place. So to suggest somehow that members of the opposition are the reason why we have seen this report delayed is simply a rewriting of history. Look at just a number of weeks ago where we had a very important study that all members of this committee agreed to. And to Mr. Assassi, who is joining us for this committee for the first time that I've sat here as the vice chair, we had an incredibly productive study. And for other accusations that have been made, I'm concerned that the precedent that is being set is to basically say that the voices of members of Parliament, and by virtue of that our constituents, are not able to be heard. Now, I don't expect that everybody agrees. I would love for everybody to agree with those of us in East Central Alberta. But I would suggest that I know full well that there's a wide variety of opinions other than that and those who I represent. So, Mr. Chair, as we come to address the motion that would basically adopt this report and to move on to recommendations, my caution would be to every member here is that members of Parliament in the committee process, this is one of those opportunities where we can have that engagement, where we can make sure that we look at the evidence, we look at the facts, we look at what government has done on any range of issues, and to ensure that we make that case to our colleagues. and then a decision is made one way or the other. So certainly there's been tempers that have flared, certainly in the House of Commons today, and there's been a few references to that. I think that certainly, and I could get very political on that
Point of order.
if there was a
Point of order. I believe I was admonished for referencing things that had happened in camera, and I believe that Mr. Kirk just did the same thing.
I was just referencing the House.
Yeah.
No, you said that we had referenced here.
I said that the House had been referenced, and Mr.
Had
Assassi
been
did.
referenced.
Mr.
Yeah.
Assassi referenced the House just a moment ago.
Okay, but,
did reference
okay, well, let's just be
No, I
careful
don't
about
believe
that.
so. Could you?
Let's just
When
be-
when did he reference the House?
Just a few minutes ago.
Is there any? I think you asked for some script or some context later. Maybe we could see the notes
Sure.
on that too and find out when he referenced the House.
Fantastic.
Okay, but let's just be careful not to delve into what has been said in camera, but let's proceed and
So, Mr. Chair, I think it behooves us all just to be careful. And I'm not going to get into what has happened in the House today, because I think that that's a debate that would devolve quickly, because it certainly was extraordinary for those who are watching. But if we would be setting precedents that I think are especially for members of the government, that need to acknowledge that it's up to the Canadian people who sits in the government benches, and for them to acknowledge that at some point they may find themselves in the opposition benches, and to deny the opportunity for meaningful engagement in an important part of the parliamentary process, I think is a troubling precedent that we should all take pause about. So, Mr. Chair, I would just note, as I appreciate Mr. Duguid and acknowledging that he delayed the committee proceedings, I would also like to apologize to the committee. There was a circumstance that led to, related to that led to a couple of members from our side as well being a couple of minutes late. So likewise, I would just acknowledge to this committee an apology for that. But with that, I'd cede the floor. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I find that this discussion is getting more productive by the minute, so I hope we can vote before 5:30 rolls around. I did want to just speak briefly to the intent behind this motion, because based on my colleague's earlier words, I fear that the intent has been misunderstood. My understanding, and certainly my experience from the Transport Committee, is that the purpose of the body of the report is to accurately depict what was presented by the witnesses. Now, in this report, there are many statements from witnesses that we disagree with, or that we think might be based on faulty assumptions or faulty data. Now, that doesn't mean that the witnesses didn't present those views and didn't present what they feel are facts. And as I read through the report, what I see is that any claims made, any facts presented, are referenced back to the witness that presented those facts. So, in terms of wanting to debate the body of the report more, I do think that that's in order. The motion on the floor simply proposes that we adopt the remainder of the body of the report in whole. Mostly, I made that motion on account of how much time the committee has already dedicated to the report. But if there are areas where my colleagues feel that the language in the report or the way in which the analysts have characterized the witness testimony is not accurate, is not true to the record, I think those kinds of amendments would be very much in order, and I would welcome them, and I think the committee could do that work. Now, this is all based on my experience on other committees, and on other committees, occasionally there are words used that we feel maybe don't reflect the testimony as accurately as they could. And in those cases, we go back to the testimony, and the analysts look up which witness presented those facts, and we
It's going to be a point of order, but
No, this is actually the substance of his motion is to pass this without debate. He seems to be amending his motion. So if he's moving an amendment to his motion, it would be important to know that, because the substance of his motion doesn't allow for what he's arguing for right now.
Well,
Mr.
I
Chair, if I
think
could
he's
clarify.
just showing that he's flexible and wants to get the report done, and he's open to other suggestions. But I don't think he's departed. I don't think he's dropped the intent of his motion. But
There are some rules that are not amendable and not debatable, but this is not one of them. Certainly, if there are paragraphs that my colleagues feel do not reflect the witness testimony, then an amendment to this motion would certainly be welcome, and we can debate that amendment. I did not mean to preclude any such debate, only to move along to what I believe to be the real work, which is going to be the recommendations. And those are going to be tough conversations, and I think interesting ones.
Point of order.
I'll leave it at that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
point of order.
yes,
There was and I know that this member, Mr. Bachrach, has never attended this while I've been on this committee before. There was a work plan done where we were supposed to finish debating the body here today.
This is
And
debate.
nothing has happened
This is
as far as
debate.
the body goes, and that would have been finished by the end of today.
This is debate.
If we hadn't been so
Not a
distracted.
point of order. Okay, Mr. Bachrach,
Mr. Chair, that was my only remark.
Okay.
It's just that I didn't want it to be characterized as an unwillingness to look at potential changes in the remaining paragraphs. Simply that we feel that the remaining paragraphs in the report accurately reflect the testimony heard by the committee, and we're willing to proceed to the recommendations at this time.
remember, there will also be a version 2. So we have a we have a chance to go over this again. So it's not, just because we adopt
meaningful
Mr.
engagement.
Just because we adopt, if we were to adopt Mr. Bachrach's motion, doesn't mean we couldn't have another look at the report. Yeah. Yeah, okay. I realize your motion is actually more definitive than that. It's to adopt the report once and for all. Okay. I thought it was just to basically adopt this version and we do the recommendations and, okay. So, so we go down to Mr. Deltel?
Yes. Thank you very much.
Start my comment, and I want to appreciate, and I want to say thank you to the member, Mr. Duguid, who said a few minutes ago that it was not correct what happened, so we deeply appreciate that. And comme le disait l'ancien Premier ministre,
As the former Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, said, sometimes when you're caught in the corner, but you have to walk on wet paint. He didn't.
and if you see the Right Honourable Mr. Chrétien this weekend, say hello to him, and he will be very proud to know that, well, there is a Conservative who will talk about you, and that. So, Mr. Speaker, seriously, the motion we have in front of us, it's not a time allocation, but it looks like a time allocation. And there is no victory when we talk about time allocation or to close a debate, and especially when we're talking about a report. We all know and recognize that the first loser of that will be democracy, because there is a change that we have in the committee. And when we study it paragraph by paragraph, for sure there is some time that we will not share the same point of view. Well, this is what democracy is all about. But shutting down the study of a report, 2/3 of the report has been done, and there is around 50 articles to study, there is no victory there. No victory at all. Et ça n'a strictement rien à voir.
And it has absolutely nothing to do with the quality of the work that the analysts have done. Well, if not, that'll give carte blanche to the analysts, and there's no debate. It is an integral part of the work that we are doing, to listen to the comments, to ask relevant questions, to analyze the information. The analysts have done extraordinary work, and like everyone, I really admire the work that they do, especially because they are especially neutral. So it means that regardless of the report, once time it has gone through parliamentarians who do their work, they need to ensure that there is a balance of the fors and against, which is and everyone wins. If we pass this motion, we know that the Liberals will vote in favor of it. It's not a victory for anyone, and it risks tarnishing the rest of the work that we've done. Secondly, I think I need to pay tribute to my colleagues who are working very studiously on this issue, particularly Mr. McLean. No one here should accuse Mr. McLean of doing filibustering, because we have all had to do filibustering at one time or another as parliamentarians, or to attack our adversaries, and say things that aren't relevant but who just waste time. But Mr. Klein never did that. And every time he opens his mouth, there are relevant quotes, information, facts that underpin his arguments. You may be in disagreement with him, but that never happens to me. Well, sometimes. But Mr. McLean is doing his work very well. And I will not allow anyone to say that he is doing a filibuster. On the contrary, he is doing his work. To wrap up, we had a colleague earlier who said that this committee is dysfunctional. And, Mr. Chair, I would say that in the 33rd Parliament there was much dysfunction in parliamentary in parliamentary committees, and the MP from Edmonton West and others got up on chairs and tables to try to attack their adversaries. We're not there yet, but perhaps our colleagues might believe that people who were part of the Rat Pack at the time. So I just wanted to mention that. Thank you. The challenge before us is how we don't drag out every paragraph and question the veracity of each number, and to try to get into the witness's head and understand their research methods and to say what they said, and that could drag on until the end times. So, Mr. McLean.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I've been trying to get quickly through this. I know that we talked about a work plan for this where we were supposed to be done in the body of this today, and yet we've been, as opposed to addressing anything in the body, we've been, I don't know, people that haven't been in this committee have come in and talked about just ignore everything in here, and yet we have all kinds of technical questions to ask, and those are technical questions where we have been asking of the analysts. Mr. Asasi has talked about 6 weeks, and I'm not sure he knows that we've been interrupted by other studies as well, including the Clean Water Study, where we looked at what was happening up in Fort McMurray at the Kearl Oil Sand Site, which was very important, and that did interrupt the work of this committee. And there's only a handful of technical things. I do notice what Mr. Asasi said as far as the, and I think he's wrong, because I have seen many committees that are far more dysfunctional. Mr. Chair, I think you do a good job in this committee, and I have seen chairs that do not do nearly as good a job as you, and you hold this committee together, and I thank you for that. I do take exception to the fact that anybody on any side of this House in questioning the words that are on paper and how they might reflect the reality as presented or the reality that needs to be questioned in the presentation is assaulting the work of the analysts. Such is not the case. We are here to ask questions. We are here to make sure that what we present in a parliamentary report is exactly what is pertinent to the Canadian people on both sides of it. And we know that the witnesses have provided information, and those witnesses come from all different walks of life. So histrionics aside from Mr. Asasi, I think it was out of order, but nevertheless, it is what it is, and we'll move. I know there was only a few other things in the report that we had questions about that should have started an hour and a half ago. So if it was just suit the chair well, I can just name a couple, like paragraph 93, when the IMF talks about $43 billion.
Well, I appreciate your willingness to complete the study, but we have Mr. Bachrach's motion.
Yes, I know, and
But I've noted that
and you have Mr.
I've noted
Bachrach
that-
saying that if there was anything to potentially amend in front of his motion, it would be okay.
Well, you could do that. Why don't we could do, this is what we could do, is we could give ourselves a time limit. You know, then if we agree.
Well,
to
I thought
time
we
limit-
had that at the beginning of this meeting.
No, if we give ourselves a time limit, we tried to do that in the steering committee. If we give ourselves a time limit and everyone agrees to it, then that shows good faith on all parts. You know, like, so if we say, why don't we give ourselves one more meeting just to talk about the body, and if we don't finish it, then if we don't finish it by the end of the meeting on May 8th, we go straight to the recommendations May 11th. And if everyone agrees, then I think in front of the Canadian public here, if everyone agrees, then I think we can do it. I think we can do it.
Yep.
I think,
Mr.
so
Chair?
why don't we propose, I can't tell anyone what to do, but it would be kind of useful if somebody suggested an amendment or something
I'll suggest an amendment. Mr.
that that's what we do, is that we give ourselves one more meeting to finish the body of the text. If it's not finished, we adopt it, and we go to the recommendations on the 11th.
I would move that, Mr. Chair, if I could, but I would add the proviso that if the suggested changes could be
Given in advance.
given in advance so that we would have a chance to
Does that work?
digest them, and I think that would make the work go
Because I think
quickly.
we can do it in 2 hours. I mean, we've got 20 pages left.
I
We've got
agree.
20. So I don't know how we do that in procedurally.
I would suggest that maybe you suspend the minutes.
I'll suspend a minute, figure out how to do that procedurally. No, I think we have a solution. I think,
Chair.
I want to finish saying what I'm going to say. I think Mr. Bachrach, I'm reading his mind. I think he's amenable to withdrawing his motion and presenting an alternative motion, which would give us one more 2-hour meeting to finish our review, the last 20 pages. And if we don't finish in the next 2 hours or by 1 o'clock Monday afternoon, then yes, we adopt the text as is, and we go to the recommendations on May 11th. So I think that's what he wants to do. Am I correct, Mr.?
I'm happy to. If indeed, Mr. Chair, if indeed the aim of the subcommittee was to adopt the body of the report at the end of the next meeting, and the Conservatives have suggested that they have amendments that they're willing to present in writing that we can debate at the next meeting, and that we'll get through those in a timely, efficient way, and at the end of the next meeting we will consider the body of the report adopted, then I'm happy.
Regardless of
I'm
whether
happy
we
to
actually got to
entertain
page 75 or if we're on page 70.
So it's okay, point of order for a second. Is a motion to withdraw debatable?
No, it's got to be.
Right.
No, he hasn't withdrawn yet. I'm suggesting that he might want to do
Okay, so
that.
we're in the midst
But,
of.
but when he does decide to withdraw, it has to be unanimous. He has to have unanimous consent. But I guess what I'm getting at is if we really are in good faith, we're going to agree that he can withdraw his motion with unanimous consent, and we're going to agree to the motion that I think he wants to present, which is that we'll give ourselves another 2 hours to finish the last 20 pages. Everyone submits their changes in advance of Monday's meeting. We get it done Monday by 1 o'clock, and we go to the recommendations on next Thursday. I think if everyone agrees to that, I take that as a sign of goodwill on the part of all parties.
Mr. Chair, if I may, it's my motion, and if I may,
Yeah.
I won't withdraw my motion, but I will amend my own motion.
But I think it's easier if you withdraw. I was speaking to the clerk. Procedurally, it's easier if you would.
Well, it's only easier if the entirety of our membership allows it to be withdrawn, and I'm not sure we have
Well, I
the
think
goodwill.
I sense the goodwill. I sense the
Yeah,
goodwill
well,
in this room.
But what I'm hearing, Mike, is that your crew would like to propose amendments, and I would like to accommodate that by extending my motion to the end of the next meeting. I think that's fair, what you've suggested, and so I would.
Okay, somebody has to propose that, I guess.
I'm happy to. I'm trying. You can't amend your own motion.
Okay, somebody will have to propose. Somebody other than yourself will have to propose that
There we go.
amendment. Vous avez la parole.
You have the floor. I move the amendment moved by Mr. Bachrach.
Peut-être que vous pourriez.
Perhaps you could read, or perhaps we could read the motion as amended. Yes, we need to have the text.
Send us the text of your original motion. Send it to the clerk, please.
Or you can at least phrase it.
Or at least if you could read it out or something. Like read it out slowly, and then Madame Posé will propose her amendment slowly, and we'll know exactly what we're voting on. Do you want to propose? You want to just
Sure.
read?
So
read?
the wording of the original motion was that the body of the report be adopted as amended. Because there were amendments already made to the
Yeah,
body
as
of the
amended
report,
to
right?
this, as amended. But
And I'm happy to welcome an amendment to that would extend the time to the end of the next meeting if the committee so chooses.
so the amendment, so basically it would read that the report be adopted no later than May 8th at le 8, j'ai dit le.
The 8th. Yes, that's right, the 8th. The report be adopted no later than May 8th at 1 p.m. in its form at that time. Well, we don't need that last part if we say if the body is adopted as amended no later than May 8th at 1 p.m. Okay, that's good. I don't know whether we really need to put that in the motion, but we're asking the members to submit their suggestions for amendments in writing before Monday's meeting. It's not necessary to put that in the motion, I don't think. It's not complicated. Ms. Posey, would you like to? Can I call the vote? Yes, because we've been talking about it. Let's call a vote. Madame Posey.
Overall amended motion, the motion as amended then right now?
Okay, as amended, it's Mr. Bachrach, well, the clerk will read it. The clerk will read it because it's been amended. Or there's a suggestion to amend it.
Without having an official text, I will, I will do my best to resume. And Madame Posey, Mr. Barak, you tell me if I'm incorrect, okay? My understanding is that the motion with the amendment, it would read in its final wording that the body of the report be adopted as amended in full no later than on May 8th at, 2023, at 1 o'clock?
Yeah, we meet at 11.
11, you said, or?
Well, we meet between 11 and 1, so
Okay, at the end of the meeting.
at the end of the meeting
At
of
1
May
o'clock.
8th or whatever, yeah.
And that is for the body of the
Yes.
report and not the recommendations.
And that we proceed to the recommendations on May 11th, I guess.
Exact.
So,
Do I need to repeat?
Is that part of the motion?
well,
I guess, I'm not sure the I guess.
well, would
part
you,
is part of the
would
motion,
somebody
right?
propose that? Would somebody propose that? Because I can't,
I propose that, Mr. Chair.
yeah. Yeah, and we'll go, okay.
Okay, she can do it.
Est-ce que vous aimeriez, Madame?
Madame Posey, would you like to add anything to your amendment? Well, I think we want people to submit their suggestions in writing, and that amendments be submitted prior to the meeting of May 8th. So the amendment by Madame Posey was just made a bit longer, I think, but I think we all understand. May 8th, 2023. We need to mark the year. So that is the motion as amendment. Do we all understand? Do you have anything to say? Shall we move to a vote? I would just like to mention, Mr. Chair, that it's perhaps not talking about time allocation, but that's exactly what it does. We've had much time. There is goodwill from all parties, and that is the strength of the Environment Committee. Can we vote on the motion as amended by Madame Posey?
And then the motion, you're right, sorry.
Ask for a point of clarification
Yes.
from the clerk.
Yes,
Does this amendment reflect the intent of the subcommittee?
yes, totally.
Okay, I'm
totally.
seeing nodding from the clerk and nodding from the chair.
It's,
so-
it does.
Okay, just because I'm hearing it construed as some kind of closure, that's not the
No, but
intention.
that's what we
The
agreed
intention
to
is-
that in the
okay.
subcommittee in
Perfect,
principle.
thank you.
So we're voting on the sub-amendment, Madame Posey's sub-amendment first.
Mr. Duguid,
In favor.
Mr. Longfield, Ms. Taylor-Roy,
In favor.
Mr. Turnbull,
In favor.
Mr. Weiler,
In favor.
Monsieur Dadtel,
Contre.
Mr. Couric,
I'm opposed.
Mr. Lake, Mr. McLean,
Opposed.
Madame Posey, Mr. Bachrach.
In favor.
Now we vote on the motion as amended.
Technically, we debate the motion, right?
If you want to, but I would take that as a,
No, we're going to vote. We're going to vote.
let's
We're
just
gonna
vote. I
get to a
think
vote. No,
we
we're
have
going to
this-
get to a vote today.
We have some goodwill here, let's not
nope.
spoil it.
Well, we did vote against this, and we're voting against the motion.
It's okay, but I know that in your hearts,
Yeah,
you're
no, I do
fine
think
with
it's
it.
important, though, that there's been the insinuation that, that this is somehow 6 weeks we've dragged this out for. Just to be clear, this study started over 400 days ago. And way before any of us on this side.
We're
were on the
looking
committee.
forward. We're forgetting
Mr.
about
Chair,
the
no,
6
but I
weeks,
just want to make that point because the point was made pretty forcefully over there. I think the last meeting we heard witnesses was 364 days ago.
no, I
and
think-
so it's just important as we're talking about this on the record because it's been in public. We're going to vote, and we'll have one more meeting, which is
Before we go to
again,
the recommendation.
Still unusual, but I just want to point out that the committee itself, far before any of us were part of it, decided to delay the adoption of this.
Well, we
report.
had legislation. It was lots of stuff
and other
going
studies.
on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mr. Duguid,
In favor.
Mr. Longfield,
In favor?
Ms. Taylor-Roy,
In favor.
Mr. Turnbull,
En faveur.
Mr. Weiler,
Favor.
Monsieur Dadtel,
Contre.
Mr. Couric,
I'm opposed.
Mr. Lake, Mr. McLean,
Opposed.
Madame Posey,
Pour.
Mr. Backrack.
Before we wrap up everything, because I know people will propose other things, I have a request to make. I don't think it takes a motion, but there are charts that were tabled in the digital binder, and I would like them to be put on the public portal. Does that require a motion? Well, that's what I was wondering. If it's public, it's public. What are you asking for again? There are documents about the investigation on the motion we worked on for 3 meetings, and it was tabled. I think they need to be translated. They are translated. I imagine they're already in the digital binder. They're not yet translated. And when they are translated, we can make them public, yes. Yes, once they are translated, we can share them.
Yeah, I just want to remind all the members of the committee that in the subcommittee report, there's direction to submit all of their suggestions for recommendations by the end of today. So that will greatly assist us in being able to move through the remainder of the report.
Oh, no, we changed that to tomorrow, end of
tomorrow?
Yeah, because today made no sense, so we made it tomorrow.
You said Monday, the 8th, didn't you?
No. What did we say? We said May 5th, end of day tomorrow. That good? Okay, Mr. Longfield.
We've had good progress today, thanks to Mr. Backrack for coming in, and I think the more we get in writing the beforehand, the better prepared we can be, so I'm glad to see that we're doing that with the recommendations as well.
Okay. Okay, meeting adjourned. Yeah, it's 5:30.